This week, Heidi is joined by Theo Clarke to talk about her personal experience of birth injury and recovery and how that experience shaped her work as a maternity campaigner. In this episode, we explore the realities of recovering from a traumatic birth, the long-term physical and emotional impacts birth injuries can have, and why postnatal care and clear information matters so much for families. We also touch on Theo's time in Parliament and the role personal experience can play in shaping public conversation about maternity care. As always, this podcast is a space for sharing lived experience, raising awareness and encouraging thoughtful discussion around pregnancy, birth and postnatal support. We hope you find this conversation informative and that it prompts reflection, questions and continued conversations about how we can support parents after birth. Welcome to this episode of the Mama podcast. I'm Heidi Eldridge, your host, and I'm the founder and CEO of Mama Academy. And here we are with the fabulous Theo Clarke. Thanks so much for joining us, Theo. I'm really looking forward to this episode and finding out all about your fabulous work. So do you want to start by sort of sharing your experience of birth trauma and tell our listeners what happened when you gave birth to your daughter?
Absolutely, Heidi, and lovely to be on the podcast today. So unfortunately, like probably many of your listeners, my birth was far from straightforward. And I had all of these expectations when I was pregnant that everything would go fine. But unfortunately, I ended up being induced because my daughter was late. And I ended up giving birth naturally, but I had a very long labour of nearly 40 hours. And when my daughter did eventually come out, I suffered from a postpartum hemorrhage and unfortunately suffered from what I now know is a very significant birth injury known as a third-degree tear. But I can tell you at the time, I didn't really know what was happening. I just realised I was bleeding very heavily after labour. And unfortunately, I got rushed into emergency surgery. And I was not allowed to have a general anaesthetic to be asleep. So I was actually awake in the operating theatre lying on the table for over 2 hours, which, as you can imagine, was pretty distressing. And I was also separated from my daughter at the time as well. And I didn't see her for a number of hours after I gave birth. So certainly not what I was expecting when I was going into labour and looking forward to meeting my daughter. And it was really that experience of having my own kind of birth trauma and the long time it's taken me to recover post-birth that's led me on the path to kind of campaigning for other mums and to try and help them to get support with their own recovery on both mental and physical health.
And when you were pregnant, did you have much knowledge of birth injuries at that time? Did you know anything about sort of the complications that could happen?
Well, that's such a good question because the honest answer is absolutely not. I mean, I did take the time to go to one of the antenatal classes with NCT with my husband. And I look back at my notes now and to be honest, it almost makes me laugh. I had things written down on my post-it like bring fairy lights, make a Spotify playlist, bring sweets and snacks for during labour. But no one had really talked to me about what might happen if something did go wrong, with the exception of an emergency cesarean. And I really didn't have any understanding of what a birth injury was. And now I've discovered that actually what I had was quite a serious tear. So that's a very small proportion, maybe 3 to 4% of the UK population. But actually, the vast majority of women will have some form of tearing. It might be much smaller, like a second degree, but they might end up having stitches straight after labour. And to be honest, it was a real shock, Heidi, when I was sent home from the hospital. I remember being handed a leaflet and I was really in no fit state after being in hospital for nearly a week with my baby. And, the only thing I could think about was sleeping and looking after myself, not looking after a newborn baby. And I remember being handed this leaflet, which had handwritten on it, third degree tear, obstetric anal sphincter injury. And I was told that I get a specialist appointment, but no one took the time to sit down and explain to me what that was, which looking back on it, I find really shocking. And that's partly why I like talking about it today, is to show that other mums who might have similar issues post-birth and might have also a birth injury that might have been missed when they were discharged from the hospital know that that's not normal and that they really should be seeking specialist help to get support.
That really is shocking. So it wasn't explained to you at all then? It was just literally written down on that leaflet and that was it? And then you were just supposedly meant to look it up yourself and find out what you needed to do?
Yeah, I mean, isn't that shocking? And I remember being given obviously a lot of medication when I left the hospital. I was on very significant painkillers with codeine because of the level of my birth injury meant I'd had this very invasive surgery, which required, months to recover from. And I remember being given a bottle of lactulose. And I remember thinking, like, why do I need to have laxatives? But now I know so much more about preventing a prolapse and other things that it was basically to stop my stitches from falling out, which was essential for the recovery to make sure that all the healing in the muscles happened after the birth and the operation. And no one had really explained to me how incredibly important those first few weeks were. Apart from obviously keeping it clean, I would have things like a sitz bath where I just sit in a few inches of water and have to be really careful not to use any kind of bath products or soap and just keep the area really clean so it didn't get infected. And I think there's so much awareness that we need to have about recovery from birth injuries and how important it is that you keep the area clean, but also to know if something's wrong. In my case, I thought I had an infection post-birth because I could see that the stitches were still there, they hadn't fallen out, and it was starting to look quite infected. And that you should go to the hospital and go and see a healthcare professional in that scenario, because the risk is that they might come out and they'd have to do the operation again.
Right, so that's so important to know about all of that. And what support was available for you, for recovery? Did you need help with your mental health as well as your physical health? Because that must have been so difficult to navigate.
Well, to be honest, you're absolutely right, Heidi. It was a really challenging time. So if I can answer kind of on both points. So firstly, on the physical recovery post-birth, I think I had all of these expectations during pregnancy that I'd be at home, I'd be breastfeeding my daughter, I'd be up for visitors in the first couple of hours or days. And I was really looking forward to meeting my daughter and showing her off to friends and family. That was absolutely not the case. I basically required 24-hour care. My husband ended up looking after our baby and we had to get professional help to come in because really I was in recovery from a major operation and I was not in any fit state to look after a newborn baby. And the second thing was because I'd had this operation for my injury, I had to be incredibly careful to be very near the toilet. And you can imagine, given my job, that I was a sitting member of parliament, we don't really get maternity leave in the way that the rest of the public does. And I literally felt like I couldn't leave the house because I couldn't control my bowels and I would have to go to the toilet at, seconds notice. Sometimes I wouldn't even make it, just going from the bathroom to the bedroom. I think once my husband found me collapsed on the floor with literally my pants around my ankles and I just like defecated all over the floor and hadn't even made it to the toilet. And that is certainly something no one had told me about. And since I've publicly talked about it, so many other women have written to me to say the same, that they were not prepared and they had no idea that things like incontinence were a potential symptom post a very difficult traumatic birth. And I think we've got to break the taboo by talking about this because you need help in that scenario and there are specialist services out there. So to answer your question, I was quite lucky that in Stafford, where I lived, I had access to a specialist hair clinic. So I've now discovered that depending on where you live, there is a postcode lottery, and that's not available in every hospital trust. So I was quite lucky that I did have a specialist who was fantastic, and she was the person that I saw kind of every week and would really help me with recovery. And then on the mental health side, I actually hadn't realised that I was not quite my usual self. It was my partner who said that I was really acting very out of character. I think because of the very traumatic experience I'd had in the hospital. I didn't realize how sort of controlling the environment I was in became very important to me. So I developed what were kind of symptoms of OCD, but also kind of PTSD symptoms. So intrusive thoughts, terror of leaving the house, absolutely convinced that my daughter was going to die. And I remember the first time I did leave to go to the pub to meet some NCT friends who I'd met during my antenatal classes. And I think the drive was like 2 or 3 miles. So we're talking 5 minutes. And I must have pulled the car over every couple of 100 meters. And I was convinced that my daughter had stopped breathing in her car seat. And I would get out and go and check on her. She was absolutely fine. But I had this kind of obsessive, like, control of my environment and these intrusive thoughts. I was just convinced my daughter was going to die. And I think that was because we were separated for about 6 hours from the birth to when I actually met her. Because when I came out of surgery, no one actually took the time to tell me where she was. She wasn't brought in to see me for a long time. and I actually thought my baby had died. And I've subsequently discovered that a lot of the separation issues mums have is in a similar scenario, right? Where you're not having that golden hour of breastfeeding on your chest for the first 60 minutes and, you're being rushed into surgery like myself and separated from your child. So in some ways I was lucky because I did have specialist help on the NHS for both my physical and mental health, but I'm very conscious that not every mum gets the same. So that's why I continue to campaign for more support for mums and also to advocate for the brilliant charities that are doing work on this.
And what other things helped? Because I know we've spoken about talking really helps. Were you able to talk about this with your friends, with your NCT friends? Because I know at that point it's quite difficult to talk about certain things if you feel that they haven't been through a similar experience. But were there other things that helped with the recovery?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. First of all, it was really difficult to talk about it early on. And only now, obviously, my daughter's now 3. So several years later, am I able to talk about it completely? But at the time, I really didn't see anyone. I kind of shut myself down. I remember I refused to have my mother-in-law come and meet our daughter for quite a while because I didn't feel capable of seeing anyone. And I was in such shock that it just didn't feel appropriate to kind of go out in public or be seen. But one of the things I did find was helpful was firstly talking to other mums who'd had a similar experience. And the Birth Trauma Association connected me with some other mums who'd suffered from birth trauma. And I think that is such an important tip that I'd give anyone listening, that if you've had a similar experience to myself or a difficult time, then do try and get in touch with someone else who's a kind of peer-to-peer supporter through one of these fantastic charities like BTA, because I think having someone who relates and gets it and knows what you've been through and can be that compassionate person is really important. And the other thing I found really helpful was writing. So I would write down kind of symptoms or my day, or, I find all these post-it notes where I'd written down like the crazy schedule that I was on when I was trying to kind of breastfeed and pump and take all my medication and take all my lactulose and all the different prescriptions I'd been given by the hospital. And I found that process of kind of writing it down really quite cathartic and helpful too.
So you've written a book as well. I mean, you've done you've done so many things in just 3 years. It's absolutely incredible. But that must have been really therapeutic for you to be writing your book as well, to be, raising such important awareness.
Well, you're so right. I mean, firstly, Heidi, I never expected to be writing a memoir about what happened to me during birth. And the reason for writing my memoir kind of came about for two fronts. The first was I really didn't know where to access help and support when I had my birth trauma. And I wanted the story of the campaign and my maternity, the campaign in Parliament, to kind of be wider talked about so people knew where to access help. But also, I did find the process unexpectedly of kind of writing down what happened to me. It was almost like it was kind of downloading it from my brain, that those really traumatic memories that I talked about in therapy when I did EMDR and other forms had almost been processed and kind of put into the manuscript. So they almost feel like one step removed from me now that I've written down my story. And it's been amazing to see the response of other mums writing to me to say that they feel less alone and that they've seen their story reflected in someone else's. And I find it astonishing how birth trauma stays with people. So mums write to me on a daily basis, and not just recent births, but women who gave birth 10, 20, 30 years ago. And they had a difficult time and they didn't have the support that I had when they gave birth. And I think when they see someone talking about it, it obviously triggers a lot of memories. I think it's really important that we talk about those and give women the time and the space to process these really difficult things that have happened to them. So I hope that breaking the taboo is firstly breaking the taboo by talking about what is a sensitive and a difficult subject that I don't think the British public talks about enough. It's been kind of swept under the carpet. But also, secondly, to kind of point women in the right direction of where to get help. And I was very grateful that a number of families who wrote to me with their stories agreed to have them included in the book. And I thought that was really important to hear directly from other mums, but also fathers too, about their experiences ranging from issues of perinatal health, birth injuries, issues with disparities in their healthcare because of their race and colour of their skin, because I wanted to also get the attention of policymakers to say maternity care is not good enough in the UK, and quite frankly, the government needs to do something about it. So I hope that the book is part of that change and continues that conversation publicly.
Absolutely. So would you say that was the turning point that made you turn all of these journals into an actual book, was when the public were sharing their experiences with you?
Yes, I mean, I think the turning point for me, sort of moving from having a private experience to being a public campaigner, was definitely that moment when I first met other mums who'd suffered from birth trauma. So I actually reached out to the chief exec of the Birth Trauma Association on Facebook to, firstly as a mum, to get support for myself, but also to find out a bit more about the policy area and see what could be done to improve care for new mums like myself. And I don't think at the time I realised, firstly, the scale of the problem, that 30,000 women every year were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. I think we always associate that with people in a war context who are most likely an armed forces veteran. And I had no idea that mums could get, similar experiences when they had something like what happened to me. And I think it was sitting in that room. And I remember I booked this room in Parliament for about, an hour for a couple of mums to come and see me for a cup of tea. And we were there for 2 hours, and they were just sharing all these extraordinary things that had happened to them. And I remember them just looking at me thinking, as a politician, which I was then, was there something I could do to help them? And you have to remember, I was not a government minister. And I was just a backbench MP who really had no expertise or specialism in the NHS at the time. But I just looked at these women and thought, who is listening to them in the government, and who is taking any action to help them? And that's really what led me to set up the all-party parliamentary group on birth trauma with Rosie Duffield MP, because I really felt that we needed a cross-party group of politicians that were going to look at birth trauma and take it seriously. And that was really the start of the idea.
Wow. And what was it like working? Because you mentioned earlier, you said that, being an MP isn't quite, you don't get the same maternity leave as others. That must have been quite unique, to having to keep working whilst you're still suffering from the birth injury. What was that like?
Well, honest answer is it was incredibly difficult. So I don't think when I got elected, and I hadn't obviously had a child yet, I realised how unique our job was. So it's pretty much the only job in Britain where we're not entitled to statutory maternity leave, which, considering we're actually the lawmakers making legislation, which other companies and you will follow as businesses, actually looking back is quite extraordinary. And I think that's very reflective of Parliament having been very traditionally a male-dominated environment. They just clearly didn't expect that women of childbearing age would ever become, politicians and makers of legislation. So there's a lot of work, I think, to do to modernise Parliament and make it more family-friendly to young mums. It became incredibly apparent to me that there was really no proper system. So when I was chief executive of a charitable organisation, I would have an acting CEO when I was off. When you're an MP, there is actually no equivalent of you who can represent you. So it became clear that lots of my job was actually not able to be done by anybody else. And I remember I'd been in hospital for, a number of nights, and I was, as I said, not in a good way post-birth. And I was receiving abuse within a week of getting out of hospital to say, why is our MP not available? We expect to have a public appointment with her. She's not been seen at XYZ public event. I couldn't even leave my bedroom, Heidi, let alone go to, host public events with constituents on major areas of policy. So that was really difficult. And I think at the beginning, I kept it very quiet and very confidential what happened to me. I think the first person I told actually was the speaker, because I had to have what's called a proxy vote, where rather than having to get the train all the way down from Stafford to London to go to Parliament to vote, they gave me basically the ability to vote remotely with another MP voting on my behalf. But I had to explain the situation to have that extended, so I didn't have to travel with my baby. So I was very lucky that I had that. And I know a lot of parliaments around the world don't have that at all, which I find astonishing. How can you possibly have a newborn baby and be expected to be voting, within a few days of giving birth, let alone if you had a difficult time like myself. So I hope also the book is really the first memoir ever by a female MP about having a baby in the House of Commons, which is a unique job. And I hope it started a conversation about how to modernise Parliament, because, I'm not standing again as an MP, and I really think it is a very difficult place to be a mum and to be at work. And if we want to have women's health being discussed, you've got to change the demographics in Parliament. And that starts with making it more family friendly so that women will stand for public office.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's such a fascinating subject and something that we don't necessarily appreciate, the job is so hard
Mm.
as it is. But when you've got young children as well and you're having to juggle all of that, that's just incredible. And I wanted to talk about your partner as well. What was it like for your husband during that time? Because he must have taken a big role on to look after you and your daughter.
Well, you're absolutely right. And firstly, it was very difficult for him. He actually ended up coming firstly into surgery with me to try and keep me calm because I was awake for such a long time. And I was incredibly distressed being in the hospital in that environment. I generally thought I was going to die on the operating table, and my husband thought he was going to be a single dad. So I think he was very traumatized by the experience of seeing me in such distress and also being separated from our daughter. And then, as I said, I was, in such a bad way physically and mentally after the birth that I couldn't really look after our daughter at all. I mean, I was focusing on my recovery. I couldn't think about anyone else's. And really, my husband did everything. And because I found it incredibly difficult to breastfeed, because I couldn't sit correctly on my perineum because of my surgery, I really couldn't hold my daughter properly. So it was very difficult for me to try and breastfeed, and I ended up having to pump and bottle feed. So my husband obviously did a lot of the feeding of our daughter for those first few weeks. And what I found really interesting was how, because he was not the patient who'd given birth, he wasn't accessed any form of mental health support afterwards. And I've now heard this from so many other fathers that I've spoken to, including in the birth trauma inquiry, that because they're technically not the mother and they're not seen as the parent who's been in hospital, they're therefore not offered support. But we're talking about people where, in one instance, a dad said to me he was literally told by the NHS staff, do you want to save your wife or your daughter? In a really dangerous situation, and was incredibly traumatized, and went on to develop depression and serious issues with their mental health, but was not treated as the patient. So I do think we need to have a wider conversation about support for dads, because fathers should be part of the conversation. And in fact, when something goes wrong, they are the ones who are going to be stepping up and looking after us. And I also think paternity leave in the UK is not long enough. I mean, 2 weeks is barely enough to look after a newborn baby with the crazy amounts of newborn sleep deprivation that we know all mums have. But then when you're recovering from surgery, like myself and others, we need full-time care. So actually, I think the dads should be allowed to be at home for longer to support us as well.
Absolutely, definitely. You've just touched upon the birth trauma inquiry. So I really wanted to talk to you about that. You set up the APPG, like you mentioned.
Mm.
So how did the birth trauma inquiry come about? What was involved? And I'd love to know all about the learnings from that, because I think our listeners would really appreciate a sort of summary of what came out of that report.
Absolutely. Well, firstly, it was quite unusual, as I said, to sort of set up this cross-party campaign. And the reason that I did that very early on was because I knew that as a backbencher, it's so hard to get government's attention and get ministers to take action, that I think throwing the scale of support across all the political parties, I felt was really important. So I wasn't kind of precious about it being one particular party. I thought it should be all of us working together to tackle maternity care, because it's an issue which is far beyond party politics, in my opinion. So Rosie Duffer was the MP that I approached because, firstly, when I started to research debates in Parliament to go and speak in other people's about women post-birth and support for their mental and physical health, Rosie had talked about suffering from a birth injury in a previous debate. And she had this brilliant line, which I loved in her speech. And she said, if Cinderella had had a third-degree tear, Prince Charming would be paying more attention. And yes, that made me laugh, but also it was a really serious point, right? We always have this kind of idealistic view of birth. So she agreed to co-chair the group with us, and we very quickly recruited a number of MPs to support us. And I think a lot of them had seen me share my story publicly and chose to be incredibly helpful. And we went on to launch this debate in Parliament, which I led that autumn. And what I find astonishing, Heidi, going back to my point about Parliament not being, discussing women's health enough, I was actually looking for somebody else's debate to speak about maternity in. And I remember going into the House of Commons committee where you could basically pitch to have subjects discussed in the chamber. And I discovered that in 1,000 years of our parliament, they had never had a debate on birth trauma. And I was absolutely shocked. And that was basically my pitch to say, well, isn't that outrageous? And we should be discussing these things. And I remember going into the chamber and talking about, the experience of the other mums that have written to me and trying to talk about the policy. But what was really unexpected was that obviously I shared my personal story in the chamber and very unexpectedly burst into tears. And that's probably the thing I'm now most well known for, having left politics, is obviously crying in the chamber of the House of Commons talking about my birth trauma story. But I think it's a really important point that shows that the trauma was still there after all that time, and it came out in my place of work. But what I wasn't expecting was that it just basically unleashed this incredible response from the public who saw it clipped on the news, and it had kind of gone viral on social media. And I was starting to be inundated. I mean, thousands of families writing to me to say they'd had similar experiences. And that's when I sat down with the MPs and said, look, this is obviously not an isolated incident. There are clearly so many families who've had a poor experience of care, or something really significant has happened to them during birth. And, why is it that maternity care is letting them down? So the birth trauma inquiry was modelled on the Australian inquiry that they did in New South Wales. And it was really to kind of hear firsthand from the public what their experiences of maternity care were, and to try and discover what the problems were. And very clear, the first headline point we found was that there was this postcode lottery in maternity care. So depending on where you live in the country, you will actually receive a different level of maternity provision. So as I described, I had access to a specialist hair clinic. If I'd been in a constituency 100 miles down the road, that might have not been the case, and there might have been no NHS provision. So that was the first thing we wanted to address, was how to have this kind of universal access to service. And secondly, it was very clear that there wasn't an integrated, joined up maternity plan across the UK. So every single individual NHS trust will interpret guidance slightly differently. And because a lot of it is guidance, it's not mandatory, there's also very different expectations of what those services are. So things like birth injuries, not every hospital would check, post-birth to see if you had a birth injury in the same way. So a lot of them being missed and mums being sent home. So our report came out with about 40 recommendations to the government, of which our headline were kind of 2 points. The first was to have a maternity commissioner who we felt would be a kind of go-to person to implement all the findings from our inquiry and many others, and also to be kind of a person reporting to the Prime Minister. And secondly, we asked for a national maternity improvement strategy. And that was really critical, I think, to have a kind of standardized approach to maternity policy. And unfortunately, we're still here now, Heidi, talking about this today. And my report now came out a long time ago. And some of those things have been implemented and some of them have not. And that's why myself and Louise Thompson have launched a petition for a maternity commissioner, because we feel that, enough time has now passed. We have got to be taking action on this. Enough has not been good enough by the current government. And so we have asked for a maternity commissioner, and any members of the public can sign our petition. And if we reach 10,000 responses, we get a response to the government. If we get to 100,000 responses, we actually get a debate at the Chamber of the Parliament to talk about why we should have that. So please do sign that petition. It's incredibly important. And we need to keep putting pressure on the government, I think, to implement these recommendations.
Definitely, absolutely. So how can people find that petition? Where is it?
So it'll be on my website, which is www.theo-clarke.org.uk. Also on my social media at Theo Clarke MP. And I've done it with Louise Thompson, who is another mum who suffered from a very traumatic birth herself. And, it's widely available. It's on Google, it's on the UK Parliament's petitions website. But please do sign that, because we need the government to take action. And I think when the public speaks and says enough is not enough, and we all want you to take action to do something about this, then this is, a really important piece of policy and a change, which I think the government could make today. And if I look back to the changes in the last sort of 18 months, Heidi, there have been a few that have been made as a result of our campaign, which is fantastic. So one of the ones I'm most proud about is the 6-week GP appointment. So when you give birth, you should be offered an appointment with your local doctor in the first kind of 6 to 8 weeks. And previously that appointment was basically focused on your newborn baby. And I remember when I went,
Mhm.
I think the entire appointment was basically about my daughter, who was absolutely fine. And in the last 2 minutes, I got asked, do you have postnatal depression? Yes or no answer. And by the way, you have 1 minute left. And I just thought that was really not acceptable. So that's a big change, that now you get asked about your physical and mental health, which is really positive. But there's obviously so much more that we could be doing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Theo, for all this work, because it's just absolutely incredible and it's clearly making such a huge difference. So what other action has the government taken as a result of this inquiry, and what more do you want them to do?
Well, I mentioned the one about the GP 6-week appointment.
Mm.
I suppose the other one I'm particularly pleased about is on mental health and birth injuries. So on birth injuries, when I was elected, we had a pilot program on what's called the OAC Care Bundle, which was basically like a training for midwives about how you look after mums with vaginal delivery, to prevent birth injuries and tears. And that was then extended to not just be a pilot in a certain number of hospitals, but was rolled out across the whole of NHS England, which is fantastic. So hopefully lots of mums will not be having birth injuries like myself, because A, they'll be reduced, and B, they'll have better support afterwards. But I'm very conscious that that was just a change in NHS England, and that's not the case in the other devolved nations in the UK. So one of the things I think the government needs to do is to look at rolling out these policies in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, and in Wales, because in fact they're in some instances living in very rural areas where it might be several hours drive to get to specialist appointments. And in some instances they're having to go, for example, if you live in Belfast, you're actually having to go to the mainland for things like support for a mum and baby unit, because they don't have one in Northern Ireland. So there's obviously a lot of issue with lack of services in the devolved nations. So lots to be done. And I also am concerned about the kind of rollback on women's health. I mean, we did a huge amount of work in the last parliament on having a women's health strategy. And I remember going in to speak about that in the chamber. And I think I thought the women's health strategy, Heidi, was a kind of annual publication. And I was just going into the library to get the latest stats. And then I remember going into the library and they said, no, this is the first ever women's health
Mm.
strategy. And isn't that astonishing
I
that
know.
like we're only talking about that in the last kind of 2 years? And I hope that now is an annual strategy and it's always updated by every government. But I think it's really indicative of the problem, right? That women's health is just underfunded, traditionally ignored, not enough policymakers talking about it. And obviously, every single person in this country will be given born to. So if you were going to pick a subject that the health secretary should pick in their top three, I would say birth should be up there because it affects all of us. So there's
Mhm.
a lot in our report which needs to be implemented. And, it was a cross-party inquiry. The previous government had accepted our call for this national maternity improvement strategy. And I think the government today could announce that they were going to do the same. And I hope that they will appoint a maternity commissioner, which is our call, because I think that would go a long way to solving a lot of the problems currently in maternity.
Absolutely. It is scandalous. I mean, there is no other word to describe it, is
Mm,
it? A lot of people come to us and say, "Oh, the work that you're doing, surely the NHS is,
mm.
is doing that." And it's like, no, unfortunately, it isn't. So the more we sort of raise our voices and raise awareness of the issues, the better, because it's definitely having an impact now, that's for sure. So given the recent scandals that we've had, about in different hospital trusts and the lack of trust by the public now with maternity care, I'm just wondering what you would like the current Prime Minister to do to take action on maternity care.
Well, I think the first headline point has to be you've got to implement the findings of previous inquiries. I mean, I know there's a call by some families to have a statutory public inquiry. I think my argument would be if you look at the number of inquiries that have already taken place. I've spoken to Donna Ockenden about her investigation into Leeds. I've spoken to Bill Kirkup about projects in Kent and many other hospitals like Oxford and
Mm.
others. And there was, at the last count, more than 600 policy recommendations of previous inquiries which have not been implemented. And many of the things that we saw as themes in the birth trauma inquiry, such as women not being listened to, lack of compassionate care, not having proper training for midwives, birth injuries being missed and being sent home from the hospital. In the worst case scenarios, a number of babies that died due to medical negligence is frankly shocking. And the statistic I find the most concerning is that the government is spending more on maternity compensation payouts than it actually is on frontline maternity care. And that can't be right. If we can actually reduce some of the issues within maternity care, you'd actually have more money to invest in frontline services, to recruit more midwives, more obstetricians, more anaesthetists, people that we need on the front line in the ward. So my kind of urgent plea to the government is, this situation seems to be getting worse, not better. I mean, the amount of hospitals which have now been downgraded by the Quality Care Commission to, not be considered good or outstanding is quite frankly too high. I mean, we need to have urgent action taken to improve maternity safety, because no mum should go through the horrific stories that I read in the birth trauma inquiry and babies sadly dying due to negligence. And I hope it's a wake-up call that the time is now to act, and there is, immediate policy actions today which the government could announce, which would make a huge difference, and they can start by implementing our report.
Yeah, me too. I really feel this national inquiry is a huge opportunity for change. And so, yeah, as a charity, we're doing everything we can to feed into that and to hold them accountable at the end of the day, to make sure these changes are actually implemented. So we shall see what happens this year. But I just wanted to end on support, because you've really mentioned that, how important it is for parents that have suffered from birth trauma get the right support. So where would you like to signpost them to, and any sort of final tips from you?
Well, that I think is the most important question of all, Heidi. So firstly, love to point anyone listening today in the direction of a few charities that I work with, and I really think are doing a fantastic job to support new mums and families. And the first is the Birth Trauma Association, which I mentioned. I first came across their Facebook group, and they have some fantastic peer-to-peer support workers. So you'll have a real person who's been through a similar experience to talk to you and give you help. And the other would be, if you've had a birth injury, do check out MASIC, who are also a fantastic charity and can give you a lot of support with recovery from birth injuries. And there are lots of others. If you go on my website, there's a whole index of kind of charities that I work with and support, whether it's postnatal depression or recovery with PTSD. There's a number of charities out there. And I think my kind of final message would be, it's okay to ask for help. And I know it's really difficult. We're talking about issues which people have a lot of shame attached to and stigma, and they don't necessarily want to admit that they have issues with their mental health or their physical health because they're embarrassed to talk about it. But actually, it's really important that you do get help. These are, really significant health concerns, and there are fantastic NHS professionals out there and charities who can support you. And if I look where I was 3 years ago when I gave birth and where I am now, I'm in a completely different place because I did get that help and support, and I was connected with other mums. And I think that's a really important message, is just to, if you have anyone also who's struggling, do encourage them to pick up the phone, to reach out to someone on Facebook, to try and contact one of us, because if you don't feel alone, that makes a huge difference to your recovery. And I think that's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. It really can make such a huge difference to you. So thank you so much, Theo, for joining us. I was just going to say, if there's any healthcare professionals listening, we've got lots of information on our website as well, and we have the Oasi Care Bundle on there, so they can take a look at that. But how can people follow you? What are your handles on social media?
Yeah, so the best one is to look me up on Instagram at Theo Clarke MP, but also do check out my podcast, Breaking the Taboo, which is where I interview a lot of healthcare professionals to give really practical advice for mums, dads, and anyone on particular issues. So hopefully that's a really great resource as well, where we kind of talk to experts. So great to be on your show, and Heidi, hope that they check out the other one as well if they've got kind of particular questions about things like preeclampsia or having twins or other more specialist subjects.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to encourage everyone to listen to your Breaking the Taboo podcast, because it's absolutely fantastic. You've done such a great job there. So thank you so much for your time, Theo. And yeah, we just wish you all the best with your campaigning.
Well, let's hope the government takes action, and they can start by reading my book. So fingers crossed. Suffice to say, we will definitely be keeping up the campaign, because this is certainly the beginning of the campaign, not the end.
Yeah, 2026 is going to be such an exciting year for change and impact.
Exactly.
Thank you, Theo.
Thanks so much.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, share it with a friend or colleague. Make sure you follow us so you don't miss out on our next episode. If you'd like to support our work by fundraising or volunteering, please email contact@mummeracademy.org.uk. For more information on pregnancy and maternity services, please visit our website at www.mummeracademy.org.uk. We're also on all of your favourite social media channels. See you next time!